Before we begin, let's get you ready for a nice, restful experience. Find a cozy spot, maybe fluff your pillow or wrap yourself in a soft blanket. Make sure you're somewhere safe where you can drift off without a care. And please, set that phone down. Phones don't belong in a castle with no magic, after all. They're far too distracting. Take a deep breath. Feel the air slide into your nose, cool and gentle like a soft breeze through a castle window. Imagine it traveling down your chest, past your shoulders, all the way to your fingertips. Hold it for a moment. Now let it out, slow and steady, like you're blowing out a candle from across the room. Your heart's slowing down now, isn't it? Good, that's the idea. Let's keep it nice and calm. This is a story about a castle. Not a grand, enchanted castle with dragons circling overhead or glowing swords hidden in dusty towers. No, this is just a regular castle perched on a hill in a quiet valley where the grass is always a little too long. The mornings are foggy. It's called Castle Somnus, named after someone's great uncle who liked naps. Nothing extraordinary happens here. The residents like it that way. They sweep floors, polish candlesticks, and spend a lot of time deciding which tea to serve at lunch. It's the kind of place where the most exciting event of the week is when someone finds a new kind of moth in the pantry. Our story begins on a Tuesday morning because Tuesdays are the least remarkable day of the week. The sun was just peeking over the hill, casting a soft, grayish light through the castle's tall, slightly smudgy windows. Lady Beatrice, who wasn't really a lady but liked the title because it sounded nice, was in the great hall inspecting a tablecloth. Tablecloth was beige, which she thought was a very practical color. It didn't show stains as much as white, but it wasn't as dreary as brown. She ran her fingers along the hem, checking for loose threads. There weren't any, but she checked twice, just to be sure. Margaret, she called to her assistant, who was dusting a chandelier with a feather duster that was slightly too short for the job. Do you think this tablecloth is centered properly? Margaret, who was 47 and had opinions about everything, but rarely shared them, squinted at the tablecloth. Looks fine to me, she said, her voice as flat as the table itself. Maybe nudge it half an inch to the left. Beatrice nodded thoughtfully, as if Margaret had just solved a great mystery. She nudged the tablecloth exactly half an inch, then stepped back to admire it. Perfect, she said, though it looked exactly the same as before. Now, let's talk about the tea selection for this afternoon's meeting. Afternoon meeting was the highlight of Castle Somnus's week, though highlight might be a strong word. It was a gathering of the castle's residents, Beatrice, Margaret, a cook named Harold, a gardener named Thom, and a young man named Percival who was in charge of counting things. Every Tuesday to discuss important matters, like whether the scones should have raisins or no raisins, or if the window in the east wing needed cleaning again. Spoiler, it always needed cleaning. Beatrice opened her notebook. A leather-bound thing with pages that smelled faintly of lavender because she kept a sachet in her desk drawer. She flipped to a page labeled Tea Inventory. We have chamomile, peppermint, and that Earl Grey from last month, she said, tapping her pencil against the page. But I'm worried the Earl Grey is getting a bit stale. Margaret, who was now dusting a portrait of Great Uncle Somnus, a man with a very impressive mustache, paused. Earl Grey doesn't go stale, she said. It just gets opinionated. Beatrice chuckled, a soft, sleepy sound that didn't disturb the quiet of the hall. Opinionated tea. I like that. Let's serve the chamomile, though. It's soothing, and Thom gets cranky if he doesn't have something calming. Thom, the gardener, was outside in the courtyard, trimming a hedge that was already perfectly square. He liked his hedges to be precise, but not too precise, because then people might think he was showing off. He snipped a single leaf, stepped back, and nodded to himself. Good enough, he muttered. The hedge didn't need trimming, but Thom believed in staying busy. A idle gardener, he often said, was just a man standing in dirt. Back in the great hall, Beatrice was now counting teaspoons. There were 24 teaspoons in the castle, which was exactly the right number for a castle of their size, according to a book she'd read called Proper Utensil Ratios for Medium-Sized Castles. She counted them twice, just to be sure no one had wandered off with one. Teaspoons, she often thought, were sneaky little things. Percival, she called. Percival, who was in the corner counting flagstones. He was up to 342, looked up. "Yes, Lady Beatrice. Have you finished the candle inventory yet?" she asked. Percival adjusted his glasses, which were slightly crooked because he'd fallen asleep on them last week. "Almost," he said. "I've counted 67 candles, but I need to check the storage room again. I think I missed a box of tapers." Beatrice nodded approvingly. "Good work. We can't have too many candles. What if we need to light the hallway during a fog?" The hallway was always foggy, because Castle Somnus sat in a valley where the air was damp and clingy. The residents didn't mind. Fog made everything feel softer, like the world was wrapped in a blanket. Plus, it gave them an excuse to light candles, which made the castle smell like wax and nostalgia. Harold the cook poked his head into the great hall. He was a large man with a beard that looked like it had been glued on by someone with shaky hands. "Beatrice," he said, "I've got the scones in the oven. Raisin or no raisin?" Beatrice tapped her chin, considering this very serious question. "No raisin," she decided. "Thom says raisins make his teeth feel weird." Harold nodded, as if this was the most reasonable thing he'd ever heard. "No raisin it is. I'll start the kettle for the chamomile." The great hall smelled faintly of baking scones now, a warm, buttery scent that mixed with the lavender from Beatrice's notebook. It was the kind of smell that made you want to close your eyes and breathe deeply, which was exactly what Margaret was doing, though she claimed she was just checking for dust in the air. Outside, Thom had moved on to inspecting the rose bushes. He didn't like roses much, they were too fussy, but he clipped a single thorn and placed it carefully in a small basket. He'd add it to the compost pile later, which he was very proud of. It was a very organized compost pile with separate sections for vegetable peels and flower trimmings. Back inside, Beatrice was now arranging chairs for the afternoon meeting. There were 6 chairs, which was one too many, but she liked to have a spare in case someone brought a guest. No one ever brought a guest, but Beatrice was a planner. She adjusted each chair so it was exactly 2 feet from its neighbor, measured with a small ruler she kept in her pocket. "Let's take a break," she said to Margaret, who had finished dusting and was now polishing a doorknob that was already shiny. "We'll reconvene at 2 for the tea meeting." Margaret nodded, yawned, and wandered off to check the linen closet. Beatrice sat down in one of the chairs, closed her eyes, and let the quiet of the castle wrap around her like a soft scarf. The world outside could keep its magic and adventures. Here in Castle Somnus, life was perfectly, wonderfully, gloriously boring. If you're still here, snuggled up in your cozy spot, that's perfect. If you're not quite comfortable yet, maybe adjust your pillow or pull that blanket a little tighter. This castle doesn't rush, and neither should you. Take a slow breath in. Feel it fill your lungs like a soft cloud settling into the valley around Castle Somnus. Hold it for a moment, then let it out, imagining it drifting away like fog over the courtyard. There's no hurry here. Everything in Castle Somnus moves at the pace of a lazy afternoon, and that's just how the residents like it. It was now 2 o'clock, and the great hall was ready for the weekly tea meeting. The beige tablecloth was perfectly centered, thanks to Beatrice's half-inch adjustment, and the 6 chairs were arranged with geometric precision. The air smelled of chamomile tea steeping in a pot that Harold had polished earlier because he believed a shiny teapot made the tea taste better. No one argued with him, mostly because it wasn't worth the effort. Beatrice stood at the head of the table, her lavender-scented notebook open to a fresh page. She'd written tea meeting agenda at the top in her neatest handwriting, which was very neat indeed. The agenda had 3 items. 1. Scone texture review. Window cleaning schedule. 3. Discussion of moth traps for the pantry. Margaret shuffled in, carrying a tray of teaspoons she'd recounted just to be safe. "Still 24, she announced, setting the tray down with a small clank. Beatrice nodded as if this was critical information. "Good," she said. "We wouldn't want to be short a spoon." Thom, the gardener, arrived next, his boots slightly muddy despite his best efforts to wipe them on the mat outside. He carried a small notebook of his own, filled with sketches of hedges and notes about soil pH levels. The roses are fine, he said, unprompted. I clipped another thorn this morning. No one asked for details, but Thom looked pleased with himself anyway. Harold bustled in with a plate of no-raisin scones, still warm from the oven. They were golden and slightly lumpy, which Harold insisted was the sign of a proper scone. Raisins would have ruined the aesthetic, he said, placing the plate in the exact center of the tablecloth. Beatrice gave him an approving nod, though she secretly preferred raisins. She just didn't want to start a debate. Percival was the last to arrive, clutching a stack of papers covered in numbers. He'd spent the morning recounting the candles and had moved on to inventorying the castle's collection of curtain rods. We have 42, he said, adjusting his crooked glasses. I think that's enough, but I'll double-check tomorrow. Beatrice wrote, curtain rods, 42 in her notebook, just in case it came up later. With everyone seated, Beatrice poured the chamomile tea. The pot made a gentle glugging sound, and the steam curled upward like tiny wisps of fog. Each resident took a cup, and for a moment, they all sat in silence, sipping and staring at the scones. It was a very comfortable silence, the kind that felt like a warm blanket on a chilly day. Let's begin, Beatrice said, capping her pencil against her notebook. First item, scone texture. Harold, your thoughts? Harold cleared his throat, which was unnecessary because everyone was already listening. I used the same recipe as last week, he said. 3 cups of flour, a pinch of salt, and just enough butter to make them crumbly but not too crumbly. I think they're adequate. Margaret took a bite, chewing slowly as if she were solving a puzzle. They're fine, she said after a long pause. Maybe a bit denser than last week's, but not in a bad way. Thom, who was crumbling his scone into tiny pieces to avoid eating it all at once, nodded. They hold together well, he said. Good for dunking. He dipped a piece into his tea, watched it soak for exactly 3 seconds, and then ate it. He looked very serious about the whole process. Percival, who was still thinking about curtain rods, said, they're nice. He didn't elaborate, which was fine because no one expected him to. Beatrice wrote, scones. Adequate, slightly dense, good for dunking in her notebook. Excellent feedback, she said. Let's move on to the window cleaning schedule. The windows of Castle Somnus were a constant topic of discussion, mostly because they were always smudged. The valley's fog left a thin film of moisture on the glass, and no matter how often they cleaned, the smudges returned. Margaret was in charge of window cleaning, and she had very strong opinions about it. I cleaned the east wing windows last Thursday, she said, stirring her tea with one of the 24 teaspoons. But the fog's been heavy this week, so they're smudgy again. I suggest we clean them every other Wednesday instead of every Thursday. Thom raised an eyebrow, which was his version of a dramatic reaction. Every other Wednesday? That's a big change. What if we miss a smudge? Margaret sighed, the kind of sigh that said she'd had this conversation before. We won't miss a smudge, she said. I have a system, vinegar, water, and a lint-free cloth. Works every time. Beatrice wrote, window cleaning. Every other Wednesday, vinegar system in her notebook. Sounds reasonable, she said. Let's try it for a month and reassess. Group nodded, though Percival was distracted, counting the number of scone crumbs on his plate. He'd reached 17 and was considering starting over to be sure. Final item, Beatrice said, flipping a page in her notebook. Moth traps for the pantry. Harold, you reported a moth sighting last week. Any updates? Harold leaned forward, his beard quivering slightly. It was just one moth, he said. Small, grayish, not very threatening. I put a sticky trap near the flour sacks, but I haven't checked it yet. Been busy with the scones. Thom perked up. Moths can be tricky, he said. They like to hide in corners. Maybe we should get lavender sachets. Moths hate lavender. Beatrice, who loved lavender, wrote moth traps. Sticky trap in place, consider lavender sachets in her notebook. Good idea, Thom, she said. Percival, can you add lavender sachets to the inventory list? Percival nodded, scribbling a note on his papers. I'll check the sachet supply tomorrow, he said. I think we have 6, but I'll confirm. The tea meeting continued for another 20 minutes, with more sipping, more scone nibbling, and a brief discussion about whether the doormats needed replacing. They didn't, but Margaret wanted to be thorough. By the time they finished, the chamomile tea was gone and the great hall felt even cozier than before. As the residents dispersed, Thom to his hedges, Margaret to her lint-free cloths, Harold to his kitchen, and Percival to his numbers, Beatrice stayed behind, stacking the teacups neatly. She hummed a little tune, one she'd heard from Great Uncle Somnus years ago. It wasn't a magical tune, just a pleasant one like the sound of a kettle simmering. The castle settled back into its quiet rhythm, the fog outside thickening as the afternoon faded into evening. Nothing exciting happened, and that was exactly the point. If you're still here, snuggled up in your cozy spot, that's perfect. If you're not quite comfortable yet, maybe adjust your pillow or pull that blanket a little tighter. This castle doesn't rush, and neither should you. Take a slow breath in. Feel it fill your lungs like a soft cloud settling into the valley around Castle Somnus. Hold it for a moment, then let it out, imagining it drifting away like fog over the courtyard. There's no hurry here. Everything in Castle Somnus moves at the pace of a lazy afternoon, and that's just how the residents like it. It was now 2 o'clock, and the great hall was ready for the weekly tea meeting. The beige tablecloth was perfectly centered, thanks to Beatrice's half-inch adjustment, and the 6 chairs were arranged with geometric precision. The air smelled of chamomile tea steeping in a pot that Harold had polished earlier because he believed a shiny teapot made the tea taste better. No one argued with him, mostly because it wasn't worth the effort. Beatrice stood at the head of the table, her lavender-scented notebook open to a fresh page. She'd written tea meeting agenda at the top in her neatest handwriting, which was very neat indeed. The agenda had 3 items. 1. Scone texture review. 2. Window cleaning schedule. 3. Discussion of moth traps for the pantry. Margaret shuffled in, carrying a tray of teaspoons she'd recounted just to be safe. Still 24, she announced, setting the tray down with a small clink. Beatrice nodded as if this was critical information. Good, she said. We wouldn't want to be short a spoon. Thom, the gardener, arrived next, his boots slightly muddy despite his best efforts to wipe them on the mat outside. He carried a small notebook of his own, filled with sketches of hedges and notes about soil pH levels. The roses are fine, he said, unprompted. I clipped another thorn this morning. No one asked for details, but Thom looked pleased with himself anyway. Harold bustled in with a plate of no-raisin scones, still warm from the oven. They were golden and slightly lumpy, which Harold insisted was the sign of a proper scone. Raisins would have ruined the aesthetic, he said, placing the plate in the exact center of the tablecloth. Beatrice gave him an approving nod, though she secretly preferred raisins. She just didn't want to start a debate. Percival was the last to arrive, clutching a stack of papers covered in numbers. He'd spent the morning recounting the candles and had moved on to inventorying the castle's collection of curtain rods. We have 42, he said, adjusting his crooked glasses. I think that's enough, but I'll double-check tomorrow. Beatrice wrote curtain rods 42 in her notebook, just in case it came up later. With everyone seated, Beatrice poured the chamomile tea. The pot made a gentle glugging sound, and the steam curled upward like tiny wisps of fog. Each resident took a cup, and for a moment, they all sat in silence, sipping and staring at the scones. It was a very comfortable silence, the kind that felt like a warm blanket on a chilly day. Let's begin, Beatrice said, capping her pencil against her notebook. First item, scone texture. Harold, your thoughts? Harold cleared his throat, which was unnecessary because everyone was already listening. I used the same recipe as last week, he said. 3 cups of flour, a pinch of salt, and just enough butter to make them crumbly but not too crumbly. I think they're adequate. Margaret took a bite, chewing slowly as if she were solving a puzzle. They're fine, she said after a long pause. Maybe a bit denser than last week's, but not in a bad way. Thom, who was crumbling his scone into tiny pieces to avoid eating it all at once, nodded. They hold together well, he said. Good for dunking. He dipped a piece into his tea, watched it soak for exactly 3 seconds, and then ate it. He looked very serious about the whole process. Percival, who was still thinking about curtain rods, said, "They're nice." He didn't elaborate, which was fine because no one expected him to. Beatrice wrote, "Scones. Adequate, slightly dense, good for dunking," in her notebook. "Excellent feedback," she said. Let's move on to the window cleaning schedule. The windows of Castle Somnus were a constant topic of discussion, mostly because they were always smudged. The valley's fog left a thin film of moisture on the glass, and no matter how often they cleaned, the smudges returned. Margaret was in charge of window cleaning, and she had very strong opinions about it. "I cleaned the east wing windows last Thursday," she said, stirring her tea with one of the 24 teaspoons. "But the fog's been heavy this week, so they're smudgy again. I suggest we clean them every other Wednesday instead of every Thursday." Thom raised an eyebrow, which was his version of a dramatic reaction. "Every other Wednesday? That's a big change. What if we miss a smudge?" Margaret sighed, the kind of sigh that said she'd had this conversation before. "We won't miss a smudge," she said. "I have a system. Vinegar, water, and a lint-free cloth. Works every time." Beatrice wrote, "Window cleaning. Every other Wednesday, vinegar system," in her notebook. "Sounds reasonable," she said. "Let's try it for a month and reassess." The group nodded, though Percival was distracted, counting the number of scone crumbs on his plate. He'd reached 17 and was considering starting over to be sure. "Final item," Beatrice said, flipping a page in her notebook. "Moth traps for the pantry. Harold, you reported a moth sighting last week. Any updates?" Harold leaned forward, his beard quivering slightly. "It was just one moth," he said. "Small, grayish, not very threatening. I put a sticky trap near the flour sacks, but I haven't checked it yet. Been busy with the scones." Thom perked up. "Moths can be tricky," he said. "They like to hide in corners. Maybe we should get lavender sachets." "Moths hate lavender." Beatrice, who loved lavender, wrote "moth traps. Sticky trap in place. Consider lavender sachets," in her notebook. "Good idea, Thom," she said. "Percival, can you add lavender sachets to the inventory list?" Percival nodded, scribbling a note on his papers. "I'll check the sachet supply tomorrow," he said. "I think we have 6, but I'll confirm." The tea meeting continued for another 20 minutes, with more sipping, more scone nibbling, and a brief discussion about whether the doormats needed replacing. They didn't, but Margaret wanted to be thorough. By the time they finished, the chamomile tea was gone, and the great hall felt even cozier than before. As the residents dispersed, Thom to his hedges, Margaret to her lint-free cloths, Harold to his kitchen, and Percival to his numbers, Beatrice stayed behind, stacking the teacups neatly. She hummed a little tune, one she'd heard from Great Uncle Somnus years ago. It wasn't a magical tune, just a pleasant one, like the sound of a kettle simmering. Castle settled back into its quiet rhythm, the fog outside thickening as the afternoon faded into evening. Nothing exciting happened, and that was exactly the point. If you're still nestled in your cozy corner, maybe with a warm blanket or a soft pillow, you're in the perfect spot. If you're not quite there yet, take a moment to sink deeper into your seat, let your shoulders relax, and breathe slowly. Inhale, imagining the air as a gentle mist, like the fog that hugs Castle Somnus. Hold it, then exhale, letting it drift away like steam from a teacup. This castle doesn't hurry, and neither should you. Everything here moves at the pace of a sleepy afternoon, and that's just how it should be. The day was winding down in Castle Somnus, the fog outside growing thicker as the evening settled in. The castle's stone walls seemed to hum with quiet contentment, as if they approved of the day's uneventful rhythm. In the kitchen, Harold was starting his soup, a task he approached with the seriousness of a scholar studying ancient text. Soup, in Harold's opinion, was the backbone of a good day. It wasn't flashy like scones or fussy like tea, but it was reliable, warm, and filled the kitchen with a comforting smell that made everyone feel at home. Harold stood at the counter, a large wooden spoon in one hand and a carrot in the other. The carrot was slightly crooked, which he found endearing. He peeled it slowly, letting the orange curls fall into a small bowl destined for Thom's compost pile. Waste not, want not, he muttered, a phrase he picked up from his grandmother, who had also been a firm believer in soup. Chop the carrot into uneven chunks, because Harold didn't believe in perfect cubes. Soup's supposed to be rustic, he'd say if anyone asked, though no one ever did. Next, he reached for an onion, its papery skin crinkling under his fingers. He peeled it carefully, squinting to avoid the inevitable sting in his eyes. One tear escaped, which he wiped away with the corner of his apron. The onion went into the pot with a satisfying sizzle, joining a knob of butter that was melting slowly on the stove. The kitchen filled with the warm, savory scent of onions, mingling with the faint chamomile lingering from the tea meeting. Harold stirred the pot, his wooden spoon moving in lazy circles. He added a pinch of salt, then paused to taste it with a smaller spoon he kept specifically for tasting. Needs a bit more, he said to himself, adding another pinch. He wasn't one for measuring spoons too fussy, but he trusted his instincts. Years of soup making had given him a sixth sense for seasoning, or so he liked to think. Meanwhile, in the storage room, Percival was still counting candles. He'd reached 72, but he was starting to suspect he'd double-counted a box of tapers. He sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by stacks of candles in various sizes short. Fat ones for the dining table, long, thin ones for the candelabras, and a few odd-shaped ones that no one knew what to do with. He picked up a stubby candle, sniffed it. It smelled like wax, unsurprisingly, and marked it on his list. 73, he said, though he wasn't entirely sure. Percival's notebook was a mess of numbers and scribbles, with columns labeled tapers, stubs, and miscellaneous. He'd started a new column for possibly melted, because a few candles looked like they'd been left too close to a fire. He adjusted his crooked glasses and sighed. Candles was soothing in its own way, but it was also a responsibility. What if they ran out during a particularly foggy week? The thought made him recount the tapers just to be safe. Back in the courtyard, Thom was tidying his gardening tools. He'd finished with the compost pile for the day and was now wiping down his pruning shears with a rag. The shears were old, with handles that were slightly loose, but Thom liked them that way. They felt familiar, like an old friend. He placed them in a wooden box alongside a trowel, a pair of gloves, and a small brush for cleaning dirt off his boots. The box was labeled Thom's Tools because he didn't trust anyone else to touch them. He glanced at the rose bushes, which were still fine, and decided to check the herb garden. The herbs, parsley, thyme, and a bit of rosemary were growing steadily, though the rosemary was looking a little droopy. Thom made a mental note to water it tomorrow, assuming he remembered. He wasn't one for writing things down, unlike Beatrice, who probably had a notebook page titled Herb Garden Observations. In the east wing, Margaret was still at her windows, her bucket of vinegar and water now half empty. She cleaned 3 windows and was working on the 4th, her lint-free cloth gliding over the glass in slow, deliberate circles. The smudges were stubborn today, probably because the fog was heavier than usual. She dipped the cloth into the bucket, wrung it out, and went back to work, humming her tuneless hum. The hallway was quiet, save for the occasional drip from the bucket and the soft squeak of the cloth against the glass. Beatrice, meanwhile, had moved to the library, a small room with shelves of dusty books that no one read but everyone admired. She was checking the book inventory because you never knew when a book might go missing. She ran her finger along the spines, reading titles like A History of Valley Fog and The Proper Care of Candelabras. She pulled one out, Etiquette for Afternoon Tea, and flipped through it, noting a chapter on the correct angle for pouring tea. She decided to bring it up at the next meeting. As she placed the book back, she noticed a speck of dust on the shelf. She wiped it away with her sleeve, then checked the rest of the shelf for good measure. Dust was sneaky, much like teaspoons, and Beatrice wasn't one to let it win. Castle settled into its evening routine, the fog outside now so thick it was like a curtain drawn across the windows. Harold's soup was simmering, filling the kitchen with warmth. Percival was up to candle 75, though he was considering a break to count curtain hooks instead. Thom was sweeping the courtyard path, even though it didn't need sweeping. Margaret was on her 5th window, her cloth still gliding smoothly. And Beatrice was planning tomorrow's agenda, her pencil scratching softly against the lavender-scented pages of her notebook. Nothing extraordinary happened, and that was the beauty of it. Castle Somnus was a place where the ordinary was celebrated, where a well-made soup or a clean window was cause for quiet pride. The fog rolled on, the candles burned low, and the residents carried on, content in their simple, uneventful lives. You're tucked into your favorite spot, maybe with a soft blanket or a cushion propping you up, you're exactly where you should be. If you're feeling a touch restless, wiggle your fingers, take a deep breath, and let it out slowly, like you're exhaling a puff of fog over Castle Somnus's quiet valley. Imagine the air moving through you, gentle and cool, like a breeze slipping through an open window. There's no need to rush. The castle's rhythm is steady and slow, and you're invited to match its pace. The evening was settling over Castle Somnus, the fog outside thickening into a soft, gray curtain that muffled the world beyond. Inside, the castle hummed with its usual quiet routines. The scent of Harold's soup carrots, onions, and a hint of thyme drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the faint lavender from Beatrice's notebook. It was the kind of evening where nothing needed to happen, and that was precisely the point. Beatrice was still in the library, her leather-bound notebook open on a small wooden table. The table had a slight wobble, which she'd noted in her furniture maintenance page, but hadn't gotten around to fixing. She was too busy with her book inventory, a task she took very seriously. The library wasn't large, maybe 30 shelves, each holding a mix of books that ranged from mildly interesting to outright soporific. There were titles like A Comprehensive Guide to Polishing Silver and The Joys of Alphabetical Filing, which Beatrice found oddly comforting. She ran her finger along a row of spines, pausing at the history of doormat weaving. She pulled it out, flipped it open, and skimmed a page about bristle density. "Fascinating," she murmured. She wasn't entirely sure why. She placed it back, aligning it perfectly with its neighbors, and made a note in her notebook. Page 47, bristle density discussion. You never knew when such information might come in handy. Beatrice moved to the next shelf, where she found a thin volume called Proper Candle Placement for Medium-Sized Castles. This was one of Percival's favorites, though he'd never admitted it. She dusted the cover with her sleeve, even though it was already clean, and added it to her inventory list. Candle placement, shelf 12, condition good. She liked lists. They made the world feel orderly, like a well-centered tablecloth. Outside, Thom was in the herb garden, crouching beside his droopy rosemary bush. The fog had left a fine mist on the leaves, making them glisten faintly in the dim evening light. Thom frowned, brushing a leaf with his thumb. "You're not thriving," he told the rosemary, as if it might reply. He didn't expect it to, of course, but talking to plants was one of his habits. He'd read in The Art of Compost that plants responded to kind words, though he suspected the book was exaggerating. Checked the soil, which was damp but not too damp. "Maybe you need more sun," he said, glancing at the gray sky. Sun was rare in the valley, but Thom was an optimist when it came to herbs. He made a mental note to ask Beatrice about moving the rosemary to a sunnier spot, assuming such a spot existed. For now, he sprinkled a handful of compost around the base, careful to use the vegetable peel section, not the grass clippings. Balance, he reminded himself, was key. In the kitchen, Harold was stirring his soup, which was now bubbling gently. He'd added a handful of chopped parsley from Thom's garden, though he hadn't told Thom yet. Harold liked to keep his ingredients a bit mysterious, mostly because it made him feel like a culinary artist. He tasted the soup again, nodding to himself. "Not bad," he said, though he added another pinch of salt for good measure. He wiped his hands on his apron, which was speckled with flour from the earlier scones, and checked the fire. It was low but steady, just the way he liked it. Margaret, meanwhile, had finished her fifth window and was taking a break in the east wing hallway. She sat on a wooden bench, her bucket of vinegar and water beside her, and sipped a cup of leftover chamomile tea. The tea was cold now, but Margaret didn't mind. She liked cold tea almost as much as hot tea, though she'd never admit it to Beatrice, who was particular about tea temperature. Margaret leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, and let the quiet of the hallway wash over her. The only sound was the faint drip of water from her cloth, which she'd hung over the bucket's edge. Percival was still in the storage room, now counting curtain hooks instead of candles. He'd given up on the candles after reaching 76, deciding he'd tackle them again tomorrow. The curtain hooks were small and fiddly, which made them a challenge, but Percival liked challenges. He lined them up on the floor, grouping them by size, small, medium, and slightly bent. 23 small, 15 medium, and 7 bent, he muttered, scribbling the numbers in his notebook. He wasn't sure why the castle needed so many curtain hooks, but he wasn't one to question tradition. Back in the library, Beatrice had moved on to a shelf of gardening books, which she kept for Thom's benefit. She pulled out The Gentle Art of Weeding and flipped through it, pausing at a chapter on identifying non-threatening weeds. She made a note to lend it to Thom, though she suspected he already knew more about weeds than the book did. She placed it back, dusted the shelf again, and sighed contentedly. The library was her favorite place in the castle, not because of the books, but because of the quiet. It was a quiet that felt like a hug, soft and familiar. The evening deepened, and the fog outside grew so thick it seemed to press against the windows. Harold's soup was nearly done, filling the kitchen with a cozy warmth. Thom was still talking to his rosemary, promising it a better tomorrow. Margaret was back at her windows, her cloth moving in slow circles. Percival was recounting the bent curtain hooks, just to be thorough. And Beatrice was closing her notebook, satisfied with her book inventory for the day. Castle Somnus carried on, its residents wrapped in their small, predictable tasks. There were no quests, no mysteries, no magic, just the gentle rhythm of a life well lived. One scone, one window, one candle at a time. If you're still snuggled up, maybe with a blanket draped over your knees or a pillow tucked just so, you're right where you belong. If you're feeling a bit restless, take a slow breath. Let it fill your chest like a soft fog rolling into Castle Somnus's valley. And exhale gently, as if you're blowing out a candle from across the room. Picture the air moving through you, calm and unhurried like the steady rhythm of the castle itself. There's no need to rush. Everything here unfolds at the pace of a sleepy evening, and you're invited to match its quiet flow. The night was settling over Castle Somnus. The fog outside now so thick it seemed to hug the stone walls, muffling the world beyond. Inside, the castle was wrapped in its usual stillness, broken only by the faint crackle of the kitchen fire and the occasional creak of a floorboard. The air carried the lingering warmth of Harold's soup, the clean sharpness of Margaret's vinegar, and the ever-present hint of lavender from Beatrice's notebook. It was a comforting blend, the kind that made you want to close your eyes and breathe deeply. In the storage room, Percival was deep in his quill-counting mission. The table before him was covered with quills, neatly arranged in rows like tiny soldiers awaiting inspection. He'd finished sorting them by color: 27 black, 19 brown, 6 gray, and was now organizing them by length. He held a black quill up to the light of a single candle, number 76. He noted, measuring it against a small ruler he kept in his pocket. 4 inches, he muttered, placing it in the medium pile. He wasn't sure why the castle needed so many quills, but Beatrice insisted on handwritten records, and Percival was nothing if not thorough. He paused to adjust his glasses, which were still crooked from that unfortunate nap last week. The storage room was dim, the candlelight casting soft shadows on the walls, but Percival found it soothing. Counting quills was like counting sheep, only less woolly. He picked up a gray quill, its tip slightly bent, and frowned. "You've seen better days," he told it, placing it in a separate pile labeled questionable. He made a note in his notebook, gray quill, bent tip, possibly usable. He wasn't sure what possibly usable meant, but it felt like the right thing to write. In the great hall, Beatrice was at her favorite table, her lavender-scented notebook open to a new page titled List of Lists. Beatrice loved lists the way Harold loved soup or Thom loved compost. They gave her a sense of control, a way to tame the chaos of the world, or at least the chaos of Castle Somnus, which wasn't very chaotic but still needed taming. She'd already listed the day's tasks, checked doormats, inventory books, planned tea meeting, and was now working on a list of future lists. Candle maintenance schedule, she wrote. Doormat bristle density review. Potential moth trap suppliers. She tapped her quill against the page, leaving a tiny ink smudge. She frowned at it, then decided it gave the page character. Beatrice was particular about her lists, but not so particular that she couldn't appreciate a good smudge. She flipped back to her tea meeting notes and added a line. Ask Harold about soup consistency for next meeting. She wasn't sure why soup consistency needed discussing, but it felt like a good addition. Lists, after all, were about possibilities. Outside, Thom was making one last check of the herb garden before heading inside. The fog had settled so heavily that the rosemary bush looked like a blurry shadow. He crouched beside it, brushing his fingers over the droopy leaves. You're still not happy, he said, as if the rosemary might confess its troubles. He sprinkled a bit more water from his dented can, careful not to drown it. Moderation, he muttered, echoing a line from The Art of Compost. He wasn't sure if it applied to rosemary, but it sounded wise. The parsley and thyme were fine, as usual, which annoyed Thom slightly. He liked plants that needed him, and the rosemary was proving to be a worthy challenge. He stood up, brushed the dirt from his knees, and added a stray twig to his compost basket. The basket was getting full 3 thorns, a leaf, a twig, and a few wilted parsley sprigs. Thom admired it for a moment, then headed toward the compost pile to sort his treasures. In the kitchen, Harold was ladling his soup into a large tureen, ready to serve for dinner. The soup had reached its ideal consistency, a fact that filled him with quiet pride. He'd added a final pinch of pepper, stirred it one last time, and declared it done. He set out 5 bowls, one for each resident, along with 5 of Margaret's carefully counted teaspoons. He wasn't sure if everyone would eat right away, but he liked to be prepared. A good soup deserved a proper presentation, even if it was just carrots and onions. Margaret was in the east wing, now on her 7th window. Her lint-free cloth was starting to look a bit worn, but it was still doing its job. She dipped it into the bucket, wrung it out, and wiped the glass in slow, deliberate circles. The smudges were less stubborn now, or maybe she was just getting better at spotting them. She hummed her tuneless hum, the sound blending with the faint drip of water from the cloth. The hallway felt peaceful, like the castle was holding its breath, waiting for the fog to thicken even more. Dinner was called soon after, and the residents gathered in the great hall. The tureen sat proudly in the center of the beige tablecloth, steam rising in lazy curls. Beatrice served the soup, careful to give everyone an equal portion. Thom complimented the thyme, which made Harold beam. Margaret ate slowly, savoring each spoonful. Percival counted the carrot chunks in his bowl, 7 for the record. And Beatrice made a mental note to add soup feedback to her next list. The castle settled into its nighttime rhythm. The fog outside now was soft, impenetrable wool. Thom's rosemary waited patiently, Margaret's windows gleamed faintly. Harold's soup warmed the hall. Percival's quills sat in neat rows, and Beatrice's list grew ever longer. Nothing extraordinary happened. And that was the heart of Castle Somnus, a place where the ordinary was cherished, where a well-counted quill or a perfectly listed task was enough to make the day feel complete. If you're still curled up in your cozy spot, maybe with a blanket tucked around you or a pillow cradling your head, you're exactly where you need to be. If you're feeling a touch restless, take a slow, deep breath, letting the air fill your lungs like a soft mist settling over Castle Somnus's foggy valley. Hold it for a moment, then exhale gently, as if you're blowing a tiny puff of steam from a teacup. There's no rush here. The castle moves at the pace of a drowsy evening, and you're invited to drift along with it. The night had fully settled over Castle Somnus, the fog outside so dense it seemed to press against the windows, turning them into soft, gray mirrors. Inside, the great hall was warm and glowing, lit by a handful of candles, carefully counted by Percival, of course. The beige tablecloth was still perfectly centered, and the tureen of Harold's carrot and onion soup sat in the middle, its steam curling upward like a lazy dream. Residents were gathered around the table, each with a bowl of soup and one of Margaret's meticulously counted teaspoons. The air smelled of thyme, wax, and a faint hint of lavender from Beatrice's ever-present notebook. Beatrice, as always, was at the head of the table, her notebook open to a page labeled Dinner Observations. She took a sip of soup, savoring the warmth, and wrote, "Soup, well-balanced, thyme prominent." She wasn't sure why she needed to note this, but it felt important. Beatrice liked to document everything, just in case the castle needed a record of soup quality in the future. Dinner conversation began slowly, as it always did. Thom, still thinking about his rosemary bush, was the first to speak. "The parsley's doing fine," he said, stirring his soup without looking up. "But that rosemary's still droopy. I'm thinking it needs more sun, but with all this fog." He trailed off, shaking his head as if the fog were a personal affront. Margaret, who was halfway through her bowl, nodded thoughtfully. "Fog's tough on plants," she said, her voice as flat as the tablecloth. "And windows. I cleaned the east wing today, but they'll be smudged again by morning." She took another sip, her teaspoon clinking softly against the bowl. Margaret had a way of making even complaints sound calming, like she was just stating facts about the weather. Harold, who was secretly pleased with the soup's reception, leaned forward, his beard brushing the edge of his bowl. "The thyme's from your garden, Thom," he said. "Gives it a nice touch." "I didn't overdo it, did I?" He looked around the table, hoping for feedback but not expecting much. Thom shrugged, dipping a piece of leftover scone into his soup. "It's good," he said. "Not too thymy." He chewed slowly, as if considering the flavor for the first time. "Maybe a bit more pepper next time?" Harold nodded, making a mental note, though he was pretty sure he'd added the perfect amount of pepper already. Percival, who was counting the number of sips he'd taken, 9 so far, looked up from his bowl. "The soup's nice," he said, adjusting his corked glasses. "I counted 7 carrot chunks in mine. Is that normal?" No one answered, because no one was sure what normal meant in the context of carrot chunks. But Beatrice wrote carrot chunks, 7 per Percival, in her notebook, just to be thorough. The conversation drifted, as it often did, to the castle's endless list of small tasks. Beatrice mentioned the doormats again, wondering if they should invest in a new one for the front door. "Bristles are fine," she said, "but they're not as welcoming as they could be." Margaret, who was in charge of doormat maintenance, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She was too busy savoring her cold tea, which she'd brought to the table because she didn't believe in wasting a good cup. Outside, Thom had left his compost basket by the herb garden, planning to sort it before bed. After dinner, he slipped out into the courtyard, where the fog was so thick he could barely see the rose bushes. He knelt by his compost pile, the pride of his gardening life, and began sorting the day's additions. The basket held 3 thorns, a leaf, a twig, and a few wilted parsley sprigs. He placed each item in its proper section: thorns in the miscellaneous pile, the leaf and twig in the grass clipping section, and the parsley in the vegetable peels. Thom turned the compost with his small shovel, careful not to disturb the balance. He'd read in The Art of Compost that a good pile needed air, so he fluffed it gently, like he was tucking in a blanket. "You're coming along nicely," he told the pile, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the compost or himself. He added the parsley sprigs, smoothing them into the pile with a satisfied nod. Compost was predictable, unlike rosemary, and Thom appreciated that. Back in the Great Hall, the dinner was winding down. Beatrice stacked the empty bowls, wiping each one with a cloth before setting it aside. Harold offered to wash them, but Beatrice insisted on doing it herself. "It's therapeutic," she said, though she wasn't sure if she meant it. She just liked things to be orderly, and a stack of clean bowls was as orderly as it got. Margaret lingered at the table, finishing her tea. She counted her sips 3 at a time, as always, and decided the cup was empty enough to set aside. She glanced at the windows, which were already fogging up again, and sighed. "Tomorrow's another day," she said, mostly to herself. She didn't mind the smudges. They gave her something to do. Percival had slipped back to the storage room, unable to resist checking his quill count one more time. He recounted the gray quills, just to be sure, and confirmed there were 6. "Good?" he muttered, scribbling a note. He was thinking about starting a new inventory, maybe the castle's collection of spare buttons, but decided to save it for tomorrow. Counting quills was enough for one night. The castle settled into its nighttime rhythm, the fog outside now a soft, impenetrable blanket. Beatrice's notebook was full of new lists, Thom's compost was neatly sorted, Harold's soup had been a success, Margaret's tea was gone, and Percival's quills were accounted for. Nothing extraordinary happened, And that was the charm of Castle Somnus, a place where a quiet dinner and a well-sorted compost pile were more than enough to make the night feel complete. If you're still nestled in your cozy corner, perhaps with a blanket pulled up to your chin or a pillow perfectly fluffed, you're right where you should be. If you're feeling a little restless, take a slow breath, letting the air fill your chest like a gentle fog rolling over Castle Somnus's quiet valley. Hold it for a moment, then exhale softly, as if you're blowing out a candle from across the room. Picture the air moving through you, calm and unhurried, like the steady rhythm of the castle's evening routines. There's no rush here. Everything unfolds at the pace of a sleepy night, and you're welcome to drift along. The night was deep and still in Castle Somnus, the fog outside so thick it seemed to wrap the castle in a soft, gray cocoon. Inside, the great hall was quiet, the glow of Percival's carefully counted candles casting gentle shadows on the stone walls. The scent of Harold's soup lingered faintly, now joined by the clean, soapy smell of dishwater as Beatrice began her bowl-washing ritual. The tureen was empty, the dinner a success, and the residents had dispersed to their evening tasks, leaving the castle in its usual state of serene predictability. Beatrice stood at a small sink just off the great hall, her sleeves rolled up and her lavender-scented notebook tucked safely on a nearby shelf. She brought the 5 soup bowls and their matching teaspoons, stocking them neatly beside the sink. Washing dishes was one of Beatrice's favorite tasks, not because it was exciting, but because it was orderly. There was something satisfying about turning a dirty bowl into a clean one, about restoring things to their proper state. She filled the sink with warm water, adding a small squirt of soap that smelled faintly of linen. The bubbles rose slowly, forming a soft layer that caught the candlelight. Beatrice dipped the first bowl into the water, scrubbing it with a soft cloth she kept specifically for dishes. She moved in slow, circular motions, much like Margaret's window cleaning technique, though Beatrice would never admit to copying her. The bowl gleamed under the water, its surface smooth and unblemished. "Good as new," she murmured, placing it on a rack to dry. She moved on to the next bowl, repeating the process with the same careful attention. Beatrice had a system: wash, rinse, inspect, dry. She inspected each bowl for lingering carrot bits or traces of time, holding it up to the candlelight to be sure. Teaspoons were next, each one polished until it shone. She counted them as she went, 5, exactly as expected. "No sneaky teaspoons today," she said to herself, though she wasn't entirely sure what she meant by it. Teaspoons, in her experience, were unpredictable. In the East Wing, Margaret was back at her windows, though she decided to stop cleaning for the night. The fog was too heavy now, and the smudges would only return by morning. She sat on her wooden bench, her bucket of vinegar and water at her feet, and stared at the 7th window she'd cleaned earlier. The glass was almost invisible in the fog, blending into the gray world outside. Margaret didn't mind the smudges. They were part of the castle, like the fog or Beatrice's list. She sipped the last of her cold chamomile tea, which she carried from the dinner table. The cup was nearly empty, but Margaret wasn't one to waste a drop. She thought about smudges, about how they were less of a problem and more of a fact of life. "You clean them, they come back," she said to the empty hallway, "like weeds." She made a mental note to tell Thom that, though she knew he'd probably take it as an insult to his gardening skills. Outside, Thom was still by his compost pile, finishing his sorting from earlier. The fog made it hard to see, but Thom knew his pile by feel. He added the twig and parsley sprigs to their respective sections, then turned the pile one last time with his shovel. The compost smelled earthy and rich, a scent that Thom found more comforting than any soup. He patted the pile gently, as if tucking it in for the night. "Sleep well," he said, though he wasn't sure if compost slept. It felt like the right thing to say. In the kitchen, Harold was wiping down the counter, his apron now speckled with soap suds as well as flour. The soup had been a hit, and he was already thinking about tomorrow's batch. Maybe he'd try potatoes instead of carrots, or add a pinch of rosemary if Thom's bush ever perked up. He hung his wooden spoon on its hook, gave the counter one last swipe, and nodded to himself. "A good day's work," he said, though the kitchen looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Percival was back in the storage room, having decided to give the quills a rest. He'd started counting spare buttons instead, because buttons were small and satisfying, like tiny coins. He lined them up on the table, sorting them by material, wood, bone, and a few metal ones that were slightly tarnished. 12 wood, 9 bone, 5 metal, he muttered, scribbling in his notebook. He wasn't sure why the castle needed buttons, but Beatrice had once mentioned something about emergency sewing, and Percival didn't question it. Beatrice finished washing the last teaspoon, placing it on the rack with a small clink. She dried her hands on a towel, then checked her notebook to make sure she hadn't forgotten anything. She added a line, bowls washed, 5, teaspoons accounted for. She closed the notebook, satisfied, and glanced at the candles burning low in the great hall. She made a mental note to ask Percival about the candle inventory, though she was sure he'd already counted them twice. The castle settled deeper into its nighttime rhythm, the fog outside now so thick it felt like a second set of walls. Beatrice's bowls gleamed on the rack. Margaret's windows waited patiently for tomorrow's smudges. Thom's compost pile rested. Harold's kitchen was spotless, and Percival's buttons were neatly sorted. Nothing remarkable happened, and that was the essence of Castle Somnus, a place where a clean bowl or well counted button was enough to make the night feel complete. You're still tucked into your cozy spot, maybe with a blanket draped over your shoulders or a pillow propped just right. You're in the perfect place. If you're feeling a bit restless, take a slow, deep breath, letting the air fill your lungs like a gentle mist settling over Castle Somnus's foggy valley. Hold it for a moment, then exhale softly, as if you're blowing out a candle from across the room. Picture the air moving through you, calm and unhurried, like the steady rhythm of the castle's quiet night. There's no rush here. Everything unfolds at the pace of a drowsy evening, and you're welcome to drift along. The night was deep and still in Castle Somnus, the fog outside so thick it seemed to wrap the castle in a soft gray blanket. Inside, the great hall was dark now, the candles burned low, leaving only a faint glow to guide the residents through their evening tasks. The air carried the lingering warmth of Harold's soup, the clean tang of Beatrice's dish soap, and the ever-present hint of lavender from her notebook. It was a comforting mix, the kind that made you want to close your eyes and breathe deeply, letting the world fade away. In the kitchen, Harold was already planning tomorrow's soup, even though the dishes from tonight's dinner were barely dry. He stood at the counter, a small notebook open beforehand, not as fancy as Beatrice's, but functional, with pages stained faintly from years of broth and butter. Harold wasn't one for lists like Beatrice, but he liked to jot down soup ideas when inspiration struck. Tonight, he was thinking about potatoes. Potatoes were reliable, he thought, not flashy like carrots or temperamental like onions. A potato soup, maybe with a touch of cream, could be just the thing for a foggy day. He scribbled potato soup, cream, salt, maybe chives in his notebook, then paused to consider the chives. Thom's herb garden had chives, but they were a bit sparse, and Harold didn't want to stress the plants. "I'll ask Thom," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he'd remember. He closed the notebook, wiped his hands on his apron, and gave the counter one last swipe with a cloth, even though it was already clean. Harold liked a tidy kitchen, the kind where you could see a reflection in the pots, though he wasn't vain enough to check. In the storage room, Percival was deep in his button-counting adventure. The quills had been set aside, their numbers confirmed, 27 black, 19 browns, 6 gray, and now the buttons were his focus. He'd lined them up on the table, their small, round shapes glinting faintly in the candlelight, candle number 77 for the record. He'd sorted them by material, wood, bone, metal, and was now grouping them by size. 12 wood, small, 8 wood, medium. 4 bone, large, he muttered, scribbling in his notebook. The metal buttons were tricky. One was so tarnished it looked more like a pebble than a button. Percival picked up the tarnished button, holding it close to his crooked glasses. "You're an odd one," he said, as if the button might explain itself. He placed it in a separate pile labeled uncertain, which was growing larger than he'd like. Buttons, he was discovering, were less predictable than quills or candles. Some had 2 holes, some had 4, and one had a strange loop on the back that Percival didn't understand. He made a note, Loop button, investigate purpose. He wasn't sure where to start, but the idea of a button mystery was oddly satisfying. Outside, Thom was making one last check of the courtyard before bed. The fog was so thick now that the herb garden was barely visible, but Thom knew it by heart. He crouched beside the rosemary bush, which was still droopy despite his earlier efforts. "You're testing me," he told it, brushing a leaf with his thumb. He sprinkled a bit more water from his dented can, then stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. The compost pile was calling, but Thom decided it could wait until morning. Even compost deserved a rest. In the east wing, Margaret was tidying her cleaning supplies. Her bucket of vinegar and water was nearly empty, and her lint-free cloth was starting to fray at the edges. She folded the cloth carefully, placing it on a shelf beside a spare bucket and a bottle of vinegar she'd bought from the same merchant who'd sold her the cloth. The merchant had promised it was the finest vinegar in the valley, which Margaret doubted, but it worked well enough. She made a mental note to order more, though she wasn't sure when the merchant would pass through again. Margaret glanced at the windows, which were already fogging up again. She didn't mind. Smudges were like old friends, always there, never demanding too much. She sat on her wooden bench, the one she always used, and ran her hand over its smooth surface, all not in the wood, which she found comforting. "You're reliable," she said to the bench, though she wasn't sure why. It just felt like the right thing to say. Beatrice, meanwhile, was in the great hall, reviewing her notebook by the light of a single candle, number 78, if Percival was counting. She'd added a new page titled Soup Plans, where she wrote, "Harold considering potatoes, possibly chives." Firm with Thom. She wasn't sure why she was tracking Harold's soup ideas, but it seemed like a good addition to her lists. Beatrice loved the way her notebook grew. Page by page, each one a small piece of the castle's quiet life. She closed the notebook, tucking her quill behind her ear, and glanced around the hall. The tablecloth was still centered, the chairs perfectly aligned, and the candles burning low. Everything was in order just the way she liked it. She made a mental note to ask Percival about the button inventory, though she was sure he'd have it under control. The castle settled deeper into its nighttime rhythm, the fog outside now a soft, impenetrable wall. Harold's potato soup plans were forming, Percival's buttons were mostly sorted, Thom's rosemary was still a mystery. Margaret's windows waited for tomorrow, and Beatrice's list grew ever longer. Nothing remarkable happened. And that was the heart of Castle Somnus, a place where a new soup idea, or a well-counted button, was enough to make a night feel complete. If you're still snuggled in your cozy spot, perhaps with a blanket tucked around you or a pillow cradling your head, you're right where you belong. If you're feeling a touch restless, take a slow, deep breath, letting the air fill your chest like a soft fog rolling over Castle Somnus's quiet valley. Hold it for a moment, then exhale gently, as if you're blowing out a candle from across the room. Picture the air moving through you, calm and unhurried, like the steady rhythm of the castle's early morning. There's no rush here. Everything unfolds at the pace of a sleepy dawn, and you're invited to drift along. Morning had arrived in Castle Somnus, the fog outside still thick, but tinged with a faint gray light that hinted at the sun somewhere far above. The castle was stirring slowly, its stone walls cool to the touch, its air carrying the faint scent of last night's soup and the ever-present lavender from Beatrice's notebook. The residents were beginning their day, each with their own quiet rituals, content in the predictable rhythm of a place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. Thom was already outside, standing in the courtyard as the fog swirled around his boots. Mornings were his favorite time to check the herb garden, when the air was fresh and the plants seemed to listen a little better. He carried his dented watering can in one hand and his compost basket in the other, just in case he found something worth adding to the pile. The rosemary bush was his first stop, as always. It was still droopy, its leaves sagging despite his best efforts. "You're a stubborn one," he told it, crouching down to inspect the soil. He poked a finger into the dirt, checking for moisture. It was damp but not soggy, which was good. Thom wasn't sure what the rosemary needed: more sun, less water, a kind word, but he wasn't giving up. He sprinkled a few drops from his watering can, careful not to overdo it, and whispered, "Come on, perk up. You can do it." He didn't expect a response, but talking to plants was part of his routine, like turning the compost or wiping down his pruning shears. The parsley and thyme were fine, as usual, their green leaves standing proud in the foggy air. Thom gave them a quick glance, satisfied, but not impressed. "You're too easy," he muttered, though he secretly appreciated their reliability. He noticed a small weed near the parsley and plucked it out, adding it to his compost basket. The basket was nearly empty this morning, just the weed and a stray leaf he'd found on the path. "You'll make fine compost," he told the weed, placing the basket by the pile for later sorting. Inside, Beatrice was in the Great Hall, sitting by a window with her notebook open and a single candle burning, number 79, if Percival's count was correct. The candlelight cast a soft glow on her pages, and she was lost in what she called her candlelight musings. Beatrice loved candles, not for their light, but for their steadiness. They burned slowly, predictably, like the castle itself. She'd written a new page titled Candle Observations, where she noted, "Candle 79 burns evenly, wax drips minimal." It wasn't critical information, but Beatrice liked to keep track. She leaned back in her chair, watching the flame flicker gently. The fog outside blurred the window, making it look like a painting of nothing in particular. Beatrice found it soothing, the way the world outside seemed to vanish into gray. She wrote another line, "Fog, heavy, as expected. Windows likely smudged." She made a mental note to ask Margaret about the cleaning schedule, though she was sure Margaret had it under control. In the kitchen, Harold was starting his day with a cup of tea peppermint, because he felt it woke him up without being too aggressive. He was still thinking about his potato soup plan, scribbling notes in his stained notebook. Potatoes, cream, chives if available. He wasn't sure if Thom's chives were up to the task, but he'd check later. For now, he was cleaning the tureen from last night's soup, scrubbing it with a cloth until it shone. Harold believed a clean tureen was essential for a good soup, like a blank canvas for a painter. Margaret was in the east wing, inspecting her windows before starting the day's cleaning. The fog had left a fresh layer of smudges, just as she predicted. She didn't mind. Smudges were her purpose, her reason to keep her lint-free cloth at the ready. She dipped it into her bucket of vinegar and water, which she'd refilled from the spare bottle, and began wiping the first window. Her movements were slow and deliberate, the cloth gliding in circles like a dancer in no hurry. The smudges vanished, leaving the glass clear, though Margaret knew they'd be back by noon. Percival was in the storage room, back at his buttonings. He'd confirmed the count 12 wood, 9 bone, 5 metal, and was now inspecting the uncertain pile. The tarnished metal button was still a mystery, its surface dull and unyielding. He held it up to the candlelight, number 80, he noted, turning it this way and that. "What's your story?" he asked, though he didn't expect an answer. He made a note, tarnished button, possible polishing required. He wasn't sure how to polish a button, but the idea was intriguing. The castle hummed along, its residents settled in their morning routines. Thom's herbs were tended, Beatrice's candle burned low, Harold's tureen gleamed, Margaret's windows shone briefly, and Percival's buttons were under scrutiny. The fog outside remained thick, wrapping the castle in its quiet embrace. Nothing remarkable happened, and that was the beauty of Castle Somnus, a place where a droopy rosemary bush or a well-observed candle was enough to make the morning feel complete. If you're still curled up in your cozy nook, maybe with a blanket tucked around your legs or a pillow propped just right, you're exactly where you should be. If you're feeling a bit restless, take a slow, deep breath, letting the air fill your chest like a gentle mist settling over Castle Somnus's foggy valley. Hold it for a moment, then exhale softly, as if you're blowing out a candle from across the room. Picture the air moving through you, calm and unhurried, like the steady rhythm of the castle's quiet morning. There's no rush here. Everything unfolds at the pace of a drowsy dawn, and you're invited to drift along. Morning was well underway in Castle Somnus, the fog outside still thick but softening slightly as the unseen sun climbed higher. The castle's stone walls were cool and quiet, the air carrying the faint scent of Harold's peppermint tea, the clean tang of Margaret's vinegar, and the ever-present lavender from Beatrice's notebook. The residents were deep in their routines, each moving through their tasks with a kind of unhurried focus that made the castle feel like a haven of calm. In the East Wing, Margaret was in her element, her lint-free cloth gliding over the 8th window of the morning. Her window-cleaning rhythm was a thing of beauty, at least to her. She dipped the cloth into her bucket of vinegar and water, wrung it out until it was just damp enough, and began wiping in slow, deliberate circles. The motion was almost hypnotic, each circle blending into the next like ripples in a still pond. Margaret didn't think about it too much. She just let her hands move, guided by years of practice. Smudges on the window were stubborn, as always, but Margaret was patient. She pressed a little harder on a particularly tricky spot, watching it vanish under her cloth. "There you go," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to the smudge or the window. The glass gleamed briefly, catching the faint morning light before the fog blurred it again. Margaret didn't mind. Smudges were like the tides, they came and went, and she was there to meet them. Stepped back to admire her work, resting her cloth on the bucket's edge. The hallway was quiet, save for the soft drip of water and the faint hum she made without realizing it. Margaret's hum was tuneless, a sound that seemed to belong to the castle itself, like the creak of a door or the flicker of a candle. She glanced at the next window, already planning her approach. "One circle at a time," she said to herself, a phrase she'd picked up from some long-forgotten book about cleaning. In the kitchen, Harold was sipping his peppermint tea, the steam curling upward like a smaller version of the fog outside. He held the cup in both hands, letting the warmth seep into his palms. Tea to Harold was more than a drink, it was a moment to pause, to think, to plan. He was still mulling over his potato soup idea, wondering if chives were the right choice. Thom's chives were fine, but they weren't as robust as he'd like. Maybe parsley instead, he thought, though parsley felt less adventurous. He set the cup down and opened his notebook, flipping to the page labeled Soup Plans. He wrote, potato soup, cream, parsley instead of chives. He wasn't sure why he phrased it as a question, but it felt right. Harold liked to keep his options open, especially when it came to soup. He took another sip of tea, savoring the sharp, minty taste. It was a good tea, not as soothing as chamomile, but perfect for a morning when he needed to feel just a little alert. Harold glanced at the tureen, still gleaming from last night's washing. He was proud of that tureen. It was old, slightly dented, but reliable. He made a mental note to tell Beatrice about his soup plans, though he wasn't sure she'd care. Beatrice was more interested in lists than recipes, but Harold liked to share anyway. It made the kitchen feel less lonely. Outside, Thom was back at his compost pile, sorting the morning's additions. His basket held the weed and leaf from earlier, plus a few carrot peels he collected from Harold's kitchen. He knelt beside the pile, carefully placing each item in its proper section: weed in the miscellaneous pile, leaf in the grass clippings, peels in the vegetable section. He turned the pile with his small shovel, fluffing it gently to let the air in. "Balance," he muttered, echoing his favorite line from The Art of Compost. A good pile needed air, just like a good soup needed salt. In the storage room, Percival was still with his buttons, now examining the uncertain pile. The tarnished metal button was still a mystery, but he'd found another oddity, a bone button with a tiny crack. He held it up to the candlelight, number 81. He noted, turning it carefully. "Or fragile," he told it, placing it in a separate pile labeled delicate. He wasn't sure what to do with delicate buttons, but he made a note: cracked bone button, handle with care. Counting buttons was soothing, like counting stars, though stars were harder to organize. Beatrice was in the Great Hall, her notebook open to a new page titled Morning Observations. She wrote, Margaret cleaning windows, steady pace, Harold planning potato soup. She wasn't sure why she needed to track these things, but it made her feel prepared. She glanced at the candle, number 79, still burning evenly, and added, candle maintenance on track. She loved the way the candlelight softened the room, making the fog outside seem like a distant dream. The castle hummed along, its residents wrapped in their quiet tasks. Margaret's cloth moved in circles. Harold's tea cooled slowly. Thom's compost pile grew. Percival's buttons were sorted, and Beatrice's lists expanded. The fog outside remained thick, wrapping the castle in its gentle embrace. Nothing remarkable happened. And that was the heart of Castle Somnus, a place where a clean window or well-planned soup was enough to make the morning feel complete. You're still nestled in your cozy spot, perhaps with a blanket draped over your shoulders or a pillow tucked just right. You're exactly where you need to be. If you're feeling a bit restless, take a slow, deep breath, letting the air fill your chest like a gentle mist rolling through Castle Somnus's foggy valley. Hold it for a moment, then exhale softly, as if you're blowing out a candle from across the room. Picture the air moving through you, calm and unhurried, like the steady rhythm of the castle's quiet morning. There's no rush here. Everything unfolds at the pace of a drowsy dawn, and you're invited to drift along. The morning was in full swing in Castle Somnus. The fog outside, still thick but softened by a faint grayish light that hinted at the sun hiding somewhere above. The castle's stone walls were cool and quiet, the air carrying the sharp scent of Margaret's vinegar, the minty tang of Harold's tea, and the ever-present lavender from Beatrice's notebook. The residents were deep in their routines, each moving through their tasks with a kind of unhurried focus that made the castle feel like a haven of calm. Beatrice was in the great hall, seated at her favorite table with her lavender-scented notebook, open to a page titled Morning List Review. She loved this ritual, the quiet moment when she could look over her lists and plan the day ahead. The candle, number 79, still burning steadily, cast a soft glow on the pages, making the ink look warm and inviting. Beatrice ran her finger down the list from yesterday. Soup feedback, window cleaning schedule, moth trap discussion. She nodded to herself, satisfied that everything was in order. She flipped to a new page labeled Today's Priorities and began writing. Check doormat bristles, confirm Harold's soup plans, Percival about button inventory. She paused, tapping her quill against the page, and added, review candle maintenance with Percival. She wasn't sure why candle maintenance needed reviewing, but it felt like a good addition. Lists to Beatrice were like a map of the castle's quiet life, each item a small landmark in an otherwise uneventful day. She glanced at the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a soft curtain. It reminded her to check with Margaret about the smudges, so she wrote, confirm window cleaning progress. Beatrice loved the way her notebook grew, page by page, each one a testament to the castle's steady rhythm. Closed it gently, tucking her quill behind her ear, and took a moment to savor the quiet of the great hall. The candle flickered, the fog swirled, and everything felt perfectly, wonderfully ordinary. Outside, Thom was back at his herb garden, still wrestling with his rosemary troubles. The bush was as droopy as ever, its leaves sagging like they were carrying the weight of the fog itself. Thom crouched beside it, his dented watering can at his side, and frowned. You're not making this easy, he told the rosemary, brushing a leaf with his thumb. He checked the soil again, finding it damp but not soggy. Maybe it's the air, he muttered, glancing at the gray sky. The valley's fog was relentless, and Thom was starting to think it was personal. He sprinkled a few drops of water from his can, careful not to overdo it, and whispered, just give me a sign. The rosemary didn't reply, but Thom wasn't discouraged. He'd read in The Art of Compost that plants could be stubborn, and he was nothing if not patient. He glanced at the parsley and thyme, which were still thriving, and gave them a grudging nod. You're showing off, he said, though he secretly admired their resilience. Thom noticed a small pebble near the rosemary's base and added it to his compost basket, which now held a weed, a leaf, and the pebble. He wasn't sure if pebbles belonged in compost, but it felt like a good addition. He headed to his pile, turning it gently with a shovel to keep the balance just right. You're doing fine, he told the pile, patting it like an old friend. In the kitchen, Harold was stirring a new pot of water, preparing for his potato soup. He decided against chives too risky with Thom's sparse supply and was leaning toward parsley. He chopped a potato, its starchy scent filling the air, and dropped it into the pot. Simple, he murmured, but reliable. He wasn't one for fancy soups, but he liked to experiment in small ways, like adding a pinch of salt before the water boiled. It felt rebellious, in a quiet sort of way. Margaret was in the east wing, now on her 9th window. Her lint-free cloth moved in slow, steady circles, erasing smudges with the precision of a painter. The fog was heavy today, leaving a fine mist on the glass, but Margaret was undaunted. She dipped her cloth into the bucket, wrung it out, and went back to work, humming her tuneless hum. The hallway was quiet, the only sound the soft squeak of the cloth against the glass. "One smudge at a time," she said, echoing her earlier thought. It wasn't profound, but it was true. Percival was in the storage room, back with his buttons. The uncertain pile was growing, with the tarnished metal button and the cracked bone button joined by a wooden button with a strange knot. He held it up to the candlelight. "Number 82, he noted, squinting through his crooked glasses. "You're a puzzle," he told it, placing it in the delicate pile. He made a note, "Naughty wooden button, further inspection needed." He wasn't sure what further inspection meant, but it sounded official. Castle hummed along, its residents wrapped in their quiet tasks. Beatrice's list grew, Thom's rosemary remained stubborn. Harold's potatoes simmered, Margaret's windows gleamed briefly, and Percival's buttons puzzled him. The fog outside stayed thick, wrapping the castle in its gentle embrace. Nothing remarkable happened, and that was the heart of Castle Somnus, a place where a new list or a droopy rosemary bush was enough to make the morning feel complete. If you're still snuggled in your cozy nook, perhaps with a blanket tucked around you or a pillow propped just so, you're right where you belong. If you're feeling a touch restless, take a slow, deep breath, letting the air fill your chest like a gentle mist curling through Castle Somnus's foggy valley. Hold it for a moment, then exhale softly, as if you're blowing out a candle from across the room. Picture the air moving through you, calm and unhurried, like the steady rhythm of the castle's quiet morning. There's no rush here. Everything unfolds at the pace of a drowsy dawn, and you're invited to drift along. The morning was deepening in Castle Somnus, the fog outside still thick but softened by a faint grayish light that hinted at the sun somewhere far above. The castle's stone walls were cool and quiet, the air carrying the starchy scent of Harold's simmering potatoes, the sharp tang of Margaret's vinegar, and the ever-present lavender from Beatrice's notebook. The residents were settled in their routines, each moving through their tasks with a kind of unhurried focus that made the castle feel like a haven of calm. In the kitchen, Harold was making steady progress on his potato soup. The pot was bubbling gently, the potatoes softening into a creamy broth that promised to be both simple and satisfying. Harold stood at the counter, stirring with his trusty wooden spoon, the one with a slightly worn handle that felt just right in his hand. He'd added a splash of cream, watching it swirl into the broth like clouds in a foggy sky. "That's the ticket," he muttered, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to. He'd decided to stick with parsley instead of chives, mostly because Thom's parsley was thriving while the chives were looking a bit sparse. Harold chopped a small handful of parsley, its fresh, green scent mingling with the potatoes. He sprinkled it into the pot, stirred, and tasted with his small tasting spoon. The flavor was gentle, not too bold, which was exactly what he wanted. "Soup's supposed to comfort, not surprise," he said to himself, echoing a line his grandmother used to say. He made a mental note to tell Beatrice about the parsley, though he was sure she'd write it down whether he mentioned it or not. Harold wiped his hands on his apron, which was now speckled with flour, soap suds, and a faint smear of parsley. He glanced at the tureen, still gleaming from last night's washing, and decided it was ready for the new soup. He ladled a small amount into a bowl to test the consistency, thick but not heavy, smooth but not bland. "Perfect," he said, nodding to himself. Harold wasn't one for boasting, but he knew a good soup when he made one. In the east wing, Margaret was still at her windows, now in her 10th of the morning. Her lint-free cloth was starting to show its age, the edges fraying slightly from years of faithful service. She held it up to the light, squinting at the threads that were pulling loose. "You've served me well," she told the cloth, as if it might appreciate the sentiment. Margaret wasn't sentimental by nature, but she had a soft spot for her cleaning tools. They were reliable, unlike the smudges that kept reappearing on the windows. She dipped the cloth into her bucket of vinegar and water, wrung it out, and went back to work, her movements slow and deliberate. The 10th window was particularly smudgy, thanks to the heavy fog. But Margaret was undaunted. She wiped in her usual circles, humming her tuneless hum, the sound blending with the faint squeak of the cloth against the glass. The smudges vanished, leaving the window clear for a moment before the fog pressed in again. "You'll be back," she said to the smudges, not unkindly. They were part of her routine, after all. Margaret paused to inspect the cloth again, running her thumb along the frayed edge. She wondered if she should order a new one from the traveling merchant, though she wasn't sure when he passed through next. Thought of a new cloth was exciting, in a quiet sort of way, but she wasn't ready to retire this one just yet. "You've got a few more windows in you," she told it, folding it carefully and setting it on the bucket's edge. Outside, Thom was checking his compost pile, adding the morning's finds: a weed, a leaf, and the pebble he wasn't sure about. He turned the pile with his shovel, fluffing it gently to keep the balance just right. "You're coming along," he said, patting the pile like an old friend. He glanced at the rosemary bush, still droopy, and sighed. "You're not making this easy," he told it, though he wasn't giving up. In the storage room, Percival was back with his buttons, still puzzling over the uncertain pile. The naughty wooden button was his current focus, its strange texture catching the candlelight. Number 83, he noted. He made a note: naughty button, possibly decorative. He wasn't sure what decorative meant in the context of buttons, but it sounded plausible. Beatrice was in the Great Hall, her notebook open to today's priorities. She added, "Harold soup, potato, parsley, no chives." She wasn't sure why she needed to track this, but it felt important. She glanced at the candle, number 79, still burning evenly, and wrote, "Candle maintenance. Check with Percival." The fog outside swirled, and Beatrice felt the castle's quiet rhythm wrap around her like a warm scarf. The castle hummed along, its residents wrapped in their tasks. Harold's soup simmered, Margaret's cloth held strong, Thom's compost grew, Percival's buttons puzzled him, and Beatrice's list expanded. The fog outside remained thick, embracing the castle in its gentle hush. Nothing remarkable happened, and that was the heart of Castle Somnus, a place where a frayed cloth or a simmering soup was enough to make the morning feel complete. If you're still curled up in your cozy nook, perhaps with a blanket tucked around you or a pillow propped just right, you're exactly where you belong. If you're feeling a bit restless, take a slow, deep breath, letting the air fill your chest like a gentle mist settling over Castle Somnus's foggy valley. Hold it for a moment, then exhale softly, as if you're blowing out the last candle in the Great Hall. Picture the air moving through you, calm and unhurried, like the steady rhythm of the castle's quiet afternoon. There's no rush here. Everything unfolds at the pace of a drowsy day, and you're invited to drift along for one final visit. The afternoon was settling over Castle Somnus, the fog outside still thick, but softened by a faint grayish light that seemed to promise another quiet day tomorrow. The castle's stone walls were cool and content, the air carrying the creamy scent of Harold's potato soup, the sharp tang of Margaret's vinegar, and the ever-present lavender from Beatrice's notebook. The residents were preparing for their weekly tea meeting, the gentle culmination of another uneventful day in a place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. In the Great Hall, Beatrice was arranging the table with her usual precision. The beige tablecloth was perfectly centered, the 6 chairs aligned exactly 2 feet apart, and the teapot polished by Harold was steaming gently with chamomile tea. Beatrice's lavender-scented notebook was open to a page titled Final Tea Meeting Agenda, with 3 items. 1. Potato soup feedback. 2. Rosemary status update. 3. Button inventory review. She counted the teaspoons, 24, as always, and placed them in a neat row beside the teapot. "No sneaky teaspoons today," she murmured, though she wasn't sure why she kept expecting them to wander off. She lit a candle, number 84, per Percival's count, and sat down, savoring the quiet before the others arrived. Margaret shuffled in, her lint-free cloth tucked into her apron pocket, its frayed edges a badge of honor. She'd finished her 11th window that morning and decided the 12th could wait until tomorrow. "Smudges aren't going anywhere," she said, taking her seat and sipping a cup of cold chamomile tea she'd brought from earlier. Beatrice wrote Margaret smudge update in her notebook, just to be thorough. Thom arrived next, his boots slightly muddy despite the courtyard's swept path. He carried his compost basket, which held a single leaf he'd found near the rosemary bush. "The parsley's fine," he said, unprompted, "but that rosemary's still droopy." He sat down, crumbling a no-raisin scone from Harold's latest batch. Beatrice added rosemary, droopy, to her notes, though she wasn't sure what to do about it. Harold bustled in with a tray of scones, his apron speckled with parsley and cream. "The potato soup's ready for dinner," he announced, setting the tray down. "Parsley, not chives." Thom's chives looked a bit sad. Thom frowned, but didn't argue. Beatrice wrote, "Soup, potato, parsley" in her notebook, pleased with the update. Percival was last, clutching his notebook filled with button counts. He adjusted his crooked glasses and sat down, muttering, 12 wood, 9 bone, 5 metal, 3 uncertain. Beatrice added, "Button inventory," pending to her agenda, though she wasn't sure why buttons needed discussing. Percival poured himself a cup of tea, counting the sips, 3 so far. The tea meeting began with Beatrice's gentle tap of her quill against the notebook. "First item, potato soup feedback," she said. Harold leaned forward, his beard quivering with anticipation. "It's creamy, but not heavy," he said. "The parsley's subtle." "Thoughts?" Margaret took a sip of her cold tea, considering. "Sounds fine," she said. "Better than carrots, maybe." Thom, still thinking about his rosemary, said, "Parsley's good, reliable." Percival, distracted by a scone crumb, said, "It's nice." Beatrice wrote, "Soup, creamy, parsley subtle," generally approved in her notebook, satisfied. "Next item, rosemary status," Beatrice said, turning to Thom. He sighed, crumbling his scone into smaller pieces. "I tried water, compost, kind words," he said. "It's still droopy. I'm thinking it's the fog." He'd made one last attempt that morning, moving the rosemary to a slightly less foggy corner of the garden, but it hadn't perked up yet. "Give it time," he said, more to himself than the group. Beatrice wrote, "Rosemary, droopy, move to new spot, monitor progress." "Final item, button inventory," Beatrice said, glancing at Percival. He perked up, flipping open his notebook. "The naughty wooden button's decorative, I think," he said. "The tarnished one might need polishing. Cracked bone button's delicate." No one was sure what to make of this, but Margaret nodded as if it made perfect sense. Beatrice wrote, "Buttons, decorative, tarnish, delicate, review next week." The meeting drifted on with more tea sipping, spoon nibbling, and quiet chatter about doormats and moth traps. The candle burned low, the fog pressed against the windows, and the great hall felt cozier than ever. As the residents finished their tea, they dispersed to their evening tasks, content in the knowledge that tomorrow would be much like today. Outside, Thom checked his rosemary one last time, whispering, "You'll be fine." The bush didn't reply, but Thom felt a flicker of hope. Harold ladled his potato soup into the tureen, proud of its creamy perfection. Margaret folded her frayed cloth, deciding it had earned a rest. Percival recounted his buttons just to be sure, and Beatrice closed her notebook, her list complete for another day. The fog wrapped Castle Somnus in its gentle embrace, the castle's rhythm steady and slow. Nothing remarkable happened, and that was the heart of its charm, a place where a droopy rosemary, a creamy soup, or a well-counted button was enough to make life feel whole. As the candle flickered out, the castle settled into its quiet night, ready to begin again tomorrow, just as it always had. "Good night,"